want to talk to you about microbes living in soils of Antarctica. And I realize that microbes at this moment probably don't have the best reputation, particularly viruses. In fact, you can blame viruses for the fact that you're probably listening to this instead of doing something more fun. But I want to remind you and really emphasize that most microbes are harmless, and some of them are actually very beneficial. So consider, for example, those microbes that live in soil. So those microbes that live in soil are really critical for a lot of functioning of the ecosystems and the health of our ecosystems. And a lot of these microbes, for example, can help plants grow well. So if you just ate lunch, or if you're thinking about eating lunch, you can thank soil microbes. So as is probably pretty clear, I'm fascinated by those microbes, the microscopic organisms that live in soil. And if you think of a soil, you probably think of a soil that looks something like this. Lots of plants growing there, lots of organic matter for the microbes to eat. But, and also I want to emphasize that in a soil like this, we're typically going to see something like 1 billion cells of microorganisms per teaspoon of soil. So lots and lots of cells. And in that same teaspoon of soil, we're probably going to see something on the order of thousands of different species of bacteria and fungi and other microorganisms living in that soil. But today I want to talk to you about a soil that looks pretty much nothing like this. Okay, they are soils. I'm going to talk to you about soils in Antarctica, but there's no plants, and they don't have that dark color that we typically associate with organic matter. So let's start our journey to Antarctica and what it's like to study microbes in soils of Antarctica. So let's start by looking at the globe from the perspective of the South Pole. And we're looking here, of course, at the continent of Antarctica. And when I say Antarctica, what do you think of? Maybe penguins, maybe ice, maybe more ice, and even more ice. And you'd be correct. So the continent of Antarctica is largely covered in ice, but there are soils there. It's not completely covered in ice. So I'm really interested in the microbes that live in the soils of Antarctica. And some of these soils are thousands of years old. They've been ice-free for thousands of years old. But you can imagine from a microbe, or from any perspective of an organism, it's a really tough place to live. Really cold, obviously. It's also very dry. The continent in general is the largest desert on the planet. And also, as I'll talk about, these soils tend to be very salty. So it's a rough place to live. So we're just interested in what organisms live there and how they're able to survive in soils of Antarctica. So how do you get to Antarctica? Well, coming from Boulder, Colorado, you spend a lot of time on planes. You watch a lot of bad movies because you have to cross all the way over the Pacific Ocean. And really the launching point for most Antarctic research is Christchurch, New Zealand, shown here. And that's where, once you finally make it to New Zealand, then you board another plane. And this is a plane operated by the National Guard of the United States. And this plane was built in the late 50s, 1950s. And when you're in it, you realize that it was built in the late 1950s. It's not the most plush planes to fly in. And what this plane does is it carries all the people, all the researchers and support staff from New Zealand to McMurdo Base, which is the largest base for Antarctic research, the largest US base for Antarctic research. And so we sit on the plane, and it's about an 8-hour flight, and it's incredibly noisy, and it's just packed with scientists and other people and lots of our gear going all the way to Antarctica. The only thing that makes the flight worthwhile is once you start going over the continent of Antarctica, you can look out the windows, these little windows, and it's simply stunning. Just the vastness of the continent and these mountains. We tend to think of Antarctica as being pretty flat, but that's not the case. There's lots of mountain ranges that crisscross Antarctica. And just to put it in perspective, so this is an entire continent. And at the peak of the Antarctic summer, when it's most habitable or most pleasant place to be for a human, which is a relative term, there's only about 1,000 to 2,000 people that live on Antarctica. So this is, smaller than even the smallest towns in the US on an entire continent. So really just amazing landscape. But our first stopping point on the continent of Antarctica was McMurdo Base, which, as I mentioned, is sort of the largest US base for scientific research, and it's where most researchers first start. And it's right on the coast of the Ross Ice Shelf. Sort of the closest landmass is, of course, New Zealand, and so that's why we flew from New Zealand to get there. And you land at McMurdo Base, and you actually land on an ice runway. So these are planes that can land on ice with these little skis. And you probably can't tell from this photo, but I was actually very enthusiastic to be there. I was just sick from being on the plane for so many hours, a bumpy plane ride for so many hours. And this is just a view of what the McMurdo Base looks like. It's kind of a mix between a mining camp and a college campus, research laboratory, and maybe a bit of it looks a little bit almost like a military base. And at the height of the season, there's maybe 800 people living there. And that's a mixture of scientists and support staff and all sorts of different people. And we were there for about a week. We needed to get the required training. We needed to get all the supplies we needed, but this was not our final destination. This was just sort of a stopping off point before we went even deeper into the continent of Antarctica. And McMurdo Base is next to open ocean, so there's cool animals there. There's Adelie penguins, there's Weddell seals, there's all sorts of animals. But where we're going in Antarctica, there are no animals, or at least no non-human animals. So these were the last animals we would see for about a month. Where we're going, there's no seals, there's no penguins, because we were on the search for microbes, arguably more interesting than penguins and seals. So our next stop was our final destination, and that is the Shackleton Glacier camp. This was a field camp that was just set up for one Antarctic summer. And to put this in perspective, so we took another flight, because you can never have too many flights, from McMurdo Base to Shackleton Glacier Camp, and this was about a 5-hour flight. So the continent is really enormous. And the camp is located right on the Transantarctic mountain range, which separates West Antarctica from East Antarctica. And this is what it looks like when you land. So this is the big transport plane that dropped us there. We land on another ice runway right in the middle of the flat part of a glacier. And you're just surrounded by these massive peaks. And I'll talk about the helicopters in a second, but the helicopters is what we use to actually get to all the places where we're collecting samples. So really stunning. And this is a view of our camp from the air. All those little yellow dots there, those are the tents that we slept in. And here's a close-up of the tent that I made home for about a month. We all slept in tents. And at the camp, when I was there was probably about 30 people, roughly 10 scientists and 20 support staff, including cooks and helicopter pilots and so forth. And this is my cozy little tent. It never got above freezing while we were there, but it wasn't that bad because it's quite dry and it's sunny because we were there at the peak of the summer, the Antarctic summer, so the sun never went down. So actually the hard part about sleeping in these tents is that there was no darkness. So even at 2 in the morning, you would need to put sunglasses on to go outside. And if you tried to sleep in the tent, you had to try to cover your eyes just because it was so bright in there. And the other thing I want to point out, this is just a view of somebody doing laundry from camp, is although there's snow and ice all over the place, it's incredibly dry there. So when snow falls, it essentially just stays on the ground and eventually sublimates or evaporates straight back to the atmosphere. So there's almost no liquid water ever on these soils or in this landscape. And that's great if you're drying laundry, because even though it's below freezing, your clothes will dry fairly quickly. But it's not a great place if you're trying to live there, just because there's an almost complete absence of liquid water. But we weren't there to just admire the scenery. We weren't just there to do laundry. We were there to hunt for microbes in soil. So we were camped on this massive glacier, and that's where we slept and so forth. But to get to the locations where we're going to collect soils, we had to fly in helicopters. And I'll admit, this was my favorite part of the trip. It's so fun to be able to hop in a helicopter and be like, let's go over to this mountain and sample some soils. And that's what we did. We flew up and down the Glacier Valley over the span of about 3 to 4 weeks, sampling soils. and really just a stunning landscape. We would fly to a spot, and usually the helicopter would leave us, and we would do our soil sampling, and we'd hope that the helicopter would eventually come back to get us. And just some views of the scenery. That's the shadow here on the glacier. That's the shadow of the helicopter. And you can see that there are spots that aren't covered in ice or snow. There's lots of exposed soils there, and it's really just a spectacular landscape. So to put this in perspective, these mountains that you're looking at here are about 10 to 11,000 feet above the glacier. So they're really enormous peaks. And the helicopter would land, and we'd get out with all of our gear, and we'd start collecting soils. So this looks just like a bunch of rocks, but these are actually soils here. And if you scrape aside the rocks, you see soils. They don't look like the soils in your backyard, but they're soils nonetheless. And most of these soils are thousands of years old, which means they've been forming for thousands of years. They've been ice-free for thousands of years. So this is not just the glacier receded and you have some soils here. These soils have been in place and pretty much like this for thousands of years. And I also want to point out that there was a few spots that we sampled where there was some liquid water. This is a lake that's partially frozen on the landscape, and you can see the people in the middle there getting ready to do some sampling. So the other thing that's also very obvious is there's no plants. So the closest plant to where we were sampling is about 2,000 miles away. There's no plants anywhere close to where we are here. And the other thing that's interesting is this lake here that's close to where we were sampling is actually very salty. And these soils in general are very salty. They accumulate salts from the atmosphere over hundreds to thousands of years. And because there's no liquid water, that salt stays in the soil. So you can imagine from a microbes perspective, this is a tough place to live. It's cold. There's no liquid water. These soils are very dry. And to make things even worse, they're also very salty. So over the span of just about a month, we ended up collecting soils from about 10 different locations across this valley. So this map is a little bit tricky because the South Pole is actually at the top of the map, and the bottom is the mouth of the glacier. So we'll sort of flipped north to south here. And just to give you some perspective on the scale of this sampling effort, you can see at the bottom there's a purple dot and a yellow dot with a red arrow. So I'm standing at the location where we collected samples from the purple dot, and the yellow dot, which was another spot where we collected samples, is way across the mouth of the glacier. And I apologize for the flexing photo, but this is what you do when you're really excited to collect soils. You have to flex afterwards, right? But you can see the scale of the landscape here. It's really quite enormous. And so fortunately, we were able to sort of go all the way across this valley and really get a good handle on all the different types of soils that we can find in this remote glacial valley in Antarctica. And the other thing that I think is really important to mention is that science is almost always a team effort. Science is rarely done by individuals working by themselves. And that was definitely the case here. So this is a photo of the field team. All of us were involved in designing the project and collecting the soils. And the team leader, Byron Adams, is shown in the green jacket there. He was sort of the one that made this all happen. He's from Brigham Young University, but we also had folks from Colorado State University, from the Ohio State University, and we also had a mountaineer, Jeff Shellens, who was assigned to keep us safe, because this is not a place where you want to injure yourself. So we ended up collecting about a little over 200 soils from north to south along this glacial valley. And we sent the soils back to my lab in Colorado. They actually had to go on an icebreaker all the way from Antarctica, all the way across the Pacific. So it took a while to get there, but eventually the soils made their way back to the laboratory, my laboratory at the University of Colorado. And I want to let you in on a little secret. So the lab looks a little bit messy, right? But this is what most labs look like. Labs very rarely look like what you see on television, really neat, impeccable, clean, maybe a couple boiling colorful liquids in the corner. They look something more like this. This means that this is a lab that's actually being used to do research. And so we get all these soils back in the lab, and then a PhD student in my lab, a graduate student in my lab, Nick Dragone, was really responsible for doing a lot of the work that I'm going to show today. I'm just going to show a few snippets of what we've been learning about these microbes living in these soils we collected from the remote Glacier Valley in Antarctica. So one thing Nick did was he said, okay, well, let's see what sort of microbes we can grow in the lab from these soils. And what you're seeing here are 6 Petri plates, and each one has just one species of bacteria growing on that plate. And you can see that they're all sorts of different colors. We've got microbes that look black, those that look red, those that look yellowish or almost mustard color. And these are all from the different pigments these bacteria are producing. And they produce these pigments presumably to protect them from the sunlight, because the sunlight is really intense in the surface of these Antarctic soils. And these pigments may also protect them from the extremely dry conditions that they face. So he was able to isolate and grow in the laboratory lots of these bacteria from soil. And he's in the process of studying them, figuring out, okay, well, how are they able to survive in these extreme conditions of Antarctica? And I'll point out that essentially everything he's been able to grow in the lab is new to science. So these are species that have not yet been described. But we also know that those bacteria you can grow in the lab are just a small fraction of all the bacteria that are actually living in the soil. Because most of the bacteria that live in the soils, in these Antarctic soils, they don't like to grow in the lab. Or even if they can be grown in the lab, they take years to grow in the lab. So it makes them hard to study. But the other thing we can do is we can use DNA sequencing to assess what sort of microbes are living in these 200 plus soils we collected from across Antarctica. So just like you and me, bacteria have DNA. And we can look at that DNA and look at the composition of that DNA to figure out what types of microbes are living in these soils. And one thing we found is that if we look at the number of different species, it's a little hard to define species of bacteria, but if we look at the numbers of different bacterial species we find per soil sample, it goes from 0, in other words, soils that had no detectable bacterial diversity or no species in them, to more than 500 species per soil sample that we collected. So to put this in perspective, if you look at a soil sample from your garden, for example, or from a park near your house, you're probably going to see way, way more bacterial species. So probably on the order of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 species. So the diversity is low, but some of these soils do have an appreciable amount of bacterial species living in them. The other thing that we can look at is what types of bacteria are living in these soils. So this is a bit hard to follow, but I'll walk you through it. So what I'm showing here are all the different soil samples we analyzed, going from south at the top to north at the bottom. And all these colors here in these bars just show different types of bacteria and their relative abundances. So the blues, the yellows, and the greens just show different major groups of bacteria and how abundant they are in each of the soil samples. So what you'll immediately see is that these soils aren't all the same. They're highly variable. So what the specific characteristics of those soils lead to different types of bacteria living in them. And the other thing that's not apparent from this slide, but you'll just have to trust me on this, is that the types of bacteria we see in Antarctica look nothing like those types of bacteria we would see in a soil near your house, in a park, in a lawn, or in your garden. These bacteria are very specifically adapted to the unique conditions of Antarctica. And most of these are unknown to science. So we can look at their DNA, we can say, okay, it's a bacteria that belongs to this group, but we don't know much about them. Some of them we do know are photosynthesizers. In other words, they can use light energy to grow. Some of them are actually able to grow on organic molecules that are extremely low concentrations from the atmosphere. Some of them can actually get their energy from using chlorine salts or nitrate salts. But what we do know is almost all of these bacteria are unique in that they are adapted to these cold and dry conditions that we see in Antarctica. So you may be wondering, if you're looking closely at this, like, what are all these gray bars at the top? Okay, what these are soils where there was no detectable microorganisms. So in most of these sites, again, the South Pole is at the top here, so the southern sites are actually at the top of this map. These soils that we collected from sort of the far end of the Glacier Valley or the southern end of the Glacial Valley, most of these soils are actually uninhabited by microbes. There's no microbes at all. We used every technique we we could get our hands on to figure out if there was any living microbes in there, and they essentially are microbe free. These soils are sterile. There's no living microorganisms in them. And what's unique about these soils is that all of these soils are cold and dry, but these soils that are uninhabited by microbes are particularly cold because they're at higher elevations. They're particularly dry. We estimate they haven't seen liquid water for about 10,000 years. And they're also very salty. So this is a picture of one of the sites. So these soils are sterile. So these are not young soils, these are old, and they're essentially uninhabited by microbes. So this was one of the most surprising and I think one of the more exciting discoveries. I wanted to see microbes in every soil, but it was actually pretty cool that we found about a third of the soils that had no microbial life. And this is interesting because the assumption is that every environment on the planet is inhabited by microbes. And to some degree, this is true. You can look at a hot spring in Yellowstone, you'll find plenty of microbes living there. You can look at the deepest depths of the ocean, you'll find microbes living there. You can look at the top of a mountain in the Atacama Desert in Chile, you'll find microbes there. But here we have a situation in Antarctica where we find lots of soils, again, about a third of those that we analyzed, where there's no detectable microbes whatsoever. So we've really identified the limits of life. So if you notice my first slide, I mentioned Mars. So let's talk about Mars briefly just to wrap up this presentation. So take a guess. These are two pictures. One's from Mars, one's from Antarctica. Which one's Mars, which one's Antarctica? We have Antarctica on the left here and Mars on the right. So if you were a keen observer, you could see there's a little bit of ice in the background here showing Antarctica. And also, if you're really looking carefully, you can see there's a helicopter there. So this is one of the sites we sampled. And I showed this picture not just because visually, where we sampled Antarctica looks what the surface of Mars looks like, but also if we look at a lot of the properties of these soils, they're actually quite similar. So both Mars and Antarctic surfaces are very cold, or often very cold, very dry, and very salty. In particular, these soils that we sampled have high concentrations of perchlorate, which is a really toxic chlorine-based salt, which we also see in very high concentrations in soils from Mars. So this was one of the reasons we were interested in these microbes in Antarctica, is because they could provide sort of they have that environment in Antarctica has a lot of similarities for what we might expect to see in soils of Mars. And what our results show is a lot of these soils in Antarctica are sterile. So if there's microbes on Mars, and we don't know, but if there are microbes on Mars, they're likely to be really hard to find and really restricted to just a few areas, because even on our own planet, there's places that have no microbes or are essentially uninhabited by microbes.